All right, so what we're going to talk about are ways to kind of further play around with our letters, how to maybe give it a drop shadow, and ways to kind of just give ourselves a more sophisticated uh, color palette. And so there are a few things we're going to do to get there. The first thing I want to tinker around with is creating this drop shadow. And so what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to copy and paste our image. So I'm just going to click and drag to highlight the whole thing. And then to copy and paste, the keyboard shortcut is going to be Command C and Command V. And that will give you a duplicate of your image. So we're going to move that over here. And now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to ungroup both of these, because you'll notice if I bring this over here, this white space is solid. And so if I want anything to come behind this object, we're not going to be able to see it. So I'm going to move it over. And then I'm going to select my image. And you'll notice that it says expand. And the reason it's giving me the option to expand is because it's still set to live paint. And we can tell because of these little cross-haired corners. So I'm going to hit expand. And then I'm going to ungroup it. And now what that means is if I grab this piece in the middle, I should be able to delete it. The downside is I can also accidentally grab the entire letter or face of the letter and move that as well. So just be mindful to group and ungroup accordingly. So now that that's been removed, I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to hit expand, ungroup, deselect, and I'm going to get rid of that little void in the middle. This isn't something you have to worry about if there aren't any negative areas in your letters. And now I'm going to regroup it. You can either go over to your properties panel and hit group. You can also hit Command G on your keyboard, and that will automatically group things. So I'm going to take this. I've just hit Command G to group it. And now what I'm going to do is if I want to create a drop shadow, I'm going to want a uniform color for this. So if I go over to my fill, I'm going to pick a pretty dark color. I could make it black, but that might feel a little bit heavy visually. So I'm going to pick a really dark color, maybe dark purple. And once I have that selected, I'm going to bring it over to my letter. And you can kind of play with placement. If you put it up here, it's going to indicate that the light is coming from below. If you put it down here, it's going to read that the light is coming from the upper right-hand corner. So you can kind of play around with placement. But the other downside is now this is covering up my primary letter. And so what we're going to do is we're going to switch these so that this object is in the front and this is in the back. There are a few ways you can go about this. And so the first thing I want you to do is over here in the layers panel, if I click this, right now you'll notice I have two groups. Now if I hit these down arrows, it becomes a little bit scary because it logs every single path and item that I have on this artboard. And it's grouped them into each individual layer. So this one becomes my R with colors, and this one's going to be my drop shadow right here. And so as we progress, we'll talk more and more about how to effectively use and organize layers. But for our purposes right now, we're only going to worry about just reorganizing these. And so this layer that I want to be underneath this R right here, if I want to move this to the back, I'm going to just click to highlight it. I'm going to click and drag, and that'll send it underneath. The other thing you can do is if you right click or control click on an object, it'll give you the option to hit arrange, and you can bring it to the front, send it to the back, or just send it forward or back one or two layers at a time. So now that this is in the back, it's kind of starting to look like a drop shadow. But we can push this even farther. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go up to the top of the screen. And then just like we did before, we're going to click on the word effect. And under effect, I'm going to hit the word blur, and I'm going to see I'm going to see what this does. It also helps if you select the object. So go to blur, click the first option. There we go. Um, and now I have a good sense of what this is starting to look like with a softer edge. So I can play around with this. If it's got a harder edge, it's going to look a little closer to the object. I'm going to give it a softer edge. I'm going to hit OK. And now it's starting to feel like this object is really coming forward. Now, if this still feels a little heavy, the next thing I can do is I can click on it. And then over in my properties panel, where it says opacity, I can again just drop down the opacity a little bit, and that'll soften it so I can really kind of tinker around with how dark or how light I want that cast shadow to be. So now that I have this, we're going to talk about other things that we can do to our background. So for right now, I'm just going to move this over to the side, and we can come back to it later if we decide we want to use it. So let's say perhaps we don't want a cast shadow. Maybe it's not quite working. Maybe we want something that's a little bit more dynamic or a little bit more energetic. We're going to play around with a few more options. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go over to my toolbar here, and we're going to use the ellipse tool. And again, if you hover over it, it'll tell you the keyboard shortcuts, which in this case is going to be the letter L. And once you've selected it, this little crosshair will come up. And I can kind of start playing around with different circle shapes. I'm not going to worry too much about how pretty they are for now. And now that I've made a few of these, I might want to rotate them, maybe stretch them out. Just to create something a little bit, a little dynamic, has some energy and some movement. And now what I want to do is I want to turn these into one form. And the way I'm going to do that is, again, I'm just going to select all of them by clicking and dragging. And now over here, you're going to find something called a Pathfinder tool. If this does not show up right away, you can find it under Window, and it'll be about 2/3 of the way down. And so with Pathfinder selected, what we're going to do is we're going to click on this first option right here, which is called Unite. So if I click it, now all of these are morphed into one form. So I don't have to move individual pieces. They're all locked together. And if I bring my R back, I'm going to have to do the same thing I did before, right? I don't think I want this giant splotch right in front of my letter. So I can right click on it. And then under Arrange, I can just send that to the back. All right. So now that I've sent that to the back, I can play around with placement a little bit. Now I'm going to have it come off the page just because I think things look better when they extend beyond the borders of the page. And again, this feels kind of heavy, so I could do things like I did here. I could play with the blur tool and soften the edges, but there are some other options that we can tinker around with as well. So what I want you to do is if you click on this, again, just to make sure that it's selected, we are going to turn the stroke on. And so I can come over here to my toolbar, and if I click this and drag it, it's actually going to turn on the stroke and match that color that I have right here just by clicking and dragging. And now that the stroke is on, which doesn't look like I've done anything because we have purple on purple, we're going to be able to play with the border a little bit. And so what I want you to do is in Window, we're going to scroll down to the option that says Brushes. And that's going to bring up a bunch of different brush options. And so some of the immediate ones, we have this sort of charcoal one. If I click on that, you'll notice as I zoom in, Now I've got these sort of more gestural, kind of expressive lines creating a contour. But in the library, there's a lot of other options that we can play with as well. So there's bristle brush, decorative. I would avoid this because it tends to look a little bit campy. Um, but there are a bunch of different options that we can play around with. So I'm going to click on artistic and um, we'll go with watercolor for no real rhyme or reason. And now if I click on this, you'll notice that these different brushes are playing with that stroke and giving it more kind of expressive, looser borders. And so this is another way of just manipulating the background and giving it some energy in a way of sort of framing our graffiti tag.